the Fix-It Fair at home, bringing you our community resources through the internet. Thank you for joining us. My name is Wing. I'm one of the coordinators of the Fix-It Fairs, their City of Portland, Oregon community resource events. And with that, thank you for joining us, Jacob. Jacob, take it away.
Excellent. Thank you, Wing. And thank you to the Fix-It Fair for having me. I'm glad to be here virtually. I was there in person when it was possible to do so, and it was a ton of fun, and this is a great way to keep the fun going. My name is Jacob Rose. I'm a contract presenter for East Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District. East Multnomah is a non-regulatory agency that helps people take care of soil and water. And at the end, I'm going to plug some resources for you to learn more about East Multnomah, the mission, and also opportunities for further learning. And so I hope you will take advantage of them. I myself am an avid gardener. I'm working in landscaping and combination of landscaping, landscape design, and restoration, habitat restoration for, I don't know, four something years now. And I am particularly interested in managing weeds. So I'm hoping that you all take a few useful nuggets home with you to wherever you garden, whether that be your backyard or community garden, what have you. So without further ado, let's get started learning about urban weeds. So I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that today where I am in Portland, Oregon, I'm on land stolen from the original people of this region. The Cowlitz, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Atfalati, and Kalapuya people have called this region home since time immemorial. They are the original stewards of this land and continue to guide us all today with their lessons and teachings and their example. Today, they're represented by different names. The Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, the Cowlitz Nation, Chinook Nation, the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians also. So today, we're gathered here today to grow in our own stewardship and pay our respects to the elders while recognizing the cultural erasure that took place and continues here today. If you want to access like this kind of map resource where you can see the historical ranges of different Native peoples, check out native-land.ca. It is a really cool resource to explore. So here's what we're going to learn today. We're also going to have a break in this. So we're going to start, learn about what is a weed. It's important to get those definitions right. Why we should control weeds. How can we help control weeds as individuals? And then really the bulk of the presentation is learning this whole cast of characters. There's a lot of weeds to learn about. There's new ones coming up all the time, unfortunately. And those are kind of split into these subcategories, ones that we find really commonly in our backyard, maybe not the biggest deal to worry about in the world, those weeds that are along waterways, and those weeds that are really high alert, and we should really be on the lookout for. And then we'll transition into thinking about what we can do after we've controlled weeds, after we've gotten a handle on them. What can we do to create habitat? So I'm excited to talk with you about that. And then we'll have some time for questions and answers, and evaluations will be sent to you at the end of the presentation. But also just feel free to ask questions as they come up, and Wing will voice those to me as they come up. So for my folks that are joining me on Zoom, I want to go ahead and launch this poll. And for those of us, or for those of y'all joining us on Facebook Live, it's great to have you. There's a little bit of delay, so just write your answers in the chat if you would like to participate. But yes. So what is a weed? Is it A, a plant that spreads rapidly, B, a plant that isn't where it's wanted, C, a plant that poses a considerable hazard, or D, a combination of the above? So I'll give that just a little bit.
Oh, hey, Jacob, this is Wing with the Fix Affairs. The second question is showing not what is a weed.
Oh, geez. I'm sorry. Let me put the right poll up with the drop-down menu. There you go. Thanks. Well, you got a preview to next question. I'll just leave this up for a little bit, maybe like another 10 seconds or so. Sorry about that. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and end that. And looks like unanimous combination of the above. And I would tend to agree with that. It is a combination of the above. A lot of times folks will say B is kind of a working definition for weeds, and I think that's fine, but I think it misses the point about the plant has to be causing some sort of hazard to also be a weed. So I would say a weed is a plant that is considered a nuisance or troublesome that grows where it's not wanted and often spreads fast, taking the place of desired plants. Two-part definition there. Or maybe another good one is a good definition is a plant that is considered a hazard or causes injury to people, animals, or desired ecosystem and crops or crop. Folks in natural resources agencies, a lot of times they're talking about this definition of weed. They maybe not as bothered by a dandelion, but more bothered by something that is going to harm livestock or something of that nature. So to get more into the weeds, pun intended, non-native is a definition also good to understand, has some not great connotations, but exotic, alien, non-indigenous, those are all some common synonyms. And when talking about weeds and these related definitions, it's important to define a geographic range. And usually we're talking about the Willamette Valley. If you're listening to a presenter from Portland, I'm probably generalizing about the Willamette Valley. Also, ornamental is a word that you might hear associated with non-native, but aggressive just means a fast-moving or spreading plant. So plenty of weeds do this, but notably there are native plants to the Willamette Valley that are aggressive as well. Invasive, this one I feel it gets misused a lot, but it's those plants that are spreading into areas where they're not native and causing ecosystem level damage. So are where they're not wanted and they're causing the damage. Another two-part definition. Noxious species or groups of species, this is the most specific definition, are those that have been legally designated as pests by a county, state, or federal agency. Around these parts, usually it's Oregon Department of Agriculture that defines noxious species. So before we go any further, let's talk a little bit about like plant biology 101. there are two main ways that plants will create more of themselves. And that's broken down into vegetative growth and reproductive growth. So vegetative growth, you'll see in this little, let's see if I can pull up my spotlight. I can't find it. Okay, well, in this graphic on the top right, you'll see like a potato plant. It can create these tubers, and it's vegetative growth. And if you were to, sever the roots between the parent plant and the tuber and plant the potatoes somewhere else, it would create a clone of that potato. So that's an example of vegetative growth. Onions grow in a similar way. Strawberries, they'll send their runners out above ground shoots, and again, those can produce new plants that will be clones of the parent plant. And in the bottom right part of this white cartoon, you'll see there's an iris. It's an illustration of iris, and so it has those rhizomes. And if you were to run a shovel through where that line is, where it says rhizome, you would also create two genetically the same irises. You create more. So that's important to understand, because we want to understand how, if our weeds reproduce vegetatively, that'll give us some clues, some indicators for controlling them. For example, if we had a weed that we were trying to control that spread a lot by the rhizomes, and then say we chopped it up and we tilled it up with a tiller. It's a really common thing to use in a garden setting. Then we might just be creating a bigger mess for ourselves by sending little bits of these rhizomes all over the place. And each one of those fractions of that root system are going to create new plants and perhaps create more of a mess for us later on. So vegetatively, really important to understand. And then I think most of us know that plants can also reproduce through sexual reproduction, and they can produce fruits and or flowers and fruits, and then eventually seeds, and those seeds can disperse a bunch of different ways. Wind, but also we see, they can stick to the fur of your dog, they can stick to your clothing, and so humans can be vectors for spreading those seeds as well. So why should we control weeds in the first place? I think it's a really fair question. There are quite a few reasons, but one of the reasons that I'd like to highlight is that it has impact on habitat and native plant species, native plant communities in our area. So invasive species are a major threat to native species because they can really grow really quickly. They tend to be, many of them tend to be very aggressive, very, very strong competitors, and reduce the light that lower, perhaps native plants on the forest floor, for example, are getting. So here we have a picture of just a sea of Himalayan blackberry and traveler's joy, or old man's beard, Clematis vitalba. And so this is a plant community that is almost entirely made up of invasive weeds. So Himalayan blackberry prevents any of these trees from receiving light to be able to push through them and create more trees. And this, in the case of the old man's beard, it can climb up these trees and actually shade out the foliage and also constrict the plant itself. So it can actually end up killing even trees just by virtue of climbing up them and then shading them out. So this is a big problem, and invasive species and their impact is second only to the impact of habitat destruction, which makes it a pretty significant player in the game. And if it weren't so terrifying, I would think these are just like purely super interesting things to consider, but weeds can have ecosystem level impacts. And by that, I mean, not only are they impacting the habitat, but they're also so like the biotic community, the living community, they're also impacting the non-living parts of these places. So they're impacting soils, the water, yeah, things of that nature. So for example, weeds can alter the disturbance regime. So in this top left graphic, you'll see that that's an example of, something that is natural to an extent of, fires, brush fires. And that's natural, but there's this example of cheatgrass, which, is really a problem in the plains and also Eastern Oregon, I think, where its disturbance regime is altered. Those areas, their disturbance regime is altered, so there's more and more fires happening because cheatgrass establishes it's more flammable than the native vegetation. It catches fire, and then also the seeds that it produces are made more viable after fire. So it creates this feedback loop where it is speeding up the fire regime in these areas by establishing, being super flammable, and then the cycle continues and accelerates. So pretty mind-boggling to think about. Weeds can also affect geomorphological processes, which, if you'll see in this bottom left photo, you see an example of an erosion. So pretty significant case of erosion. So this stream, streams naturally erode, streams naturally carry sediment, but the rate at which they do erode this and create, new curvature in a stream, that is mitigated and heavily influenced by the root systems of all these plant communities. So if we just have one weed on the side of the stream bank, and say that weed doesn't really have a very deep root system, or it doesn't have a really great ability to hold that soil in place, that soil is going to be washed away even quicker, and so hasten the pace of erosion. So that's an example of how weeds can impact erosion. Hydrology, they can change how water moves around an area. So this is a picture of Oaks Bottom in the top right, and that's purple loosestrife. And purple loosestrife is, even though it's really pretty, but it creates more land where before there was open water. So it can, if you think about it, if there's water flowing before purple loosestrife showed up, if water is flowing, this way, and then there's a little island that's created is higher than the water level, that can send the water a different direction, or it can cause stagnation, things like that. So pretty significant impact on places like Oaks Bottom. And soil chemistry, some plants, such as garlic mustard, will emit chemicals into the soil and prevent other plants, potentially native plants, from growing and establishing there. So, but there are other plants that aren't weeds necessarily that do this as well. Like walnut trees are an example of something they'll emit juglones into the soil and prevent other kinds of plants from growing there. So hopefully you all are somewhat convinced that it's a problem. So how can we help to control weeds? What are some of the things that we can do? Well, there's a bunch of things. We can avoid purchasing potential weeds in the first place. That is actually a pretty big one. Nurseries, big commercial nurseries are still selling things that are pretty weedy, or things that are invasive species that are getting into natural areas and causing harm. 2, we can control and remove the weeds where you live, whether that's backyard, front yard, community garden, your neighborhood. You can minimize the spread of weeds. You can volunteer to clear out invasives from your favorite natural area. Quite a few organizations that that participate in like the No Ivy Day. So that's, you know, a fun way to get involved in your community and to control different weeds. And usually, I mean, I guess I'm biased, but I think it's a ton of fun. And also, you can attend a naturescaping class or other similar class hosted. Well, East Multnomah hosts a naturescaping class. You can attend that or a similar class, learn about how you can use native plants to transform your landscape into a healthy contributor to this ecosystem, and learn a little bit more about how to transform your landscape at the end of this presentation. So let's talk about those first 3 mostly. Avoid purchasing potential weeds. So you can do this by taking a weeds list with you when going to purchase plants. The Portland Plant List, which is a document that we'll reference in this presentation. At the end of that, in the appendices, there's a really good weeds list. Also, East Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District has a good list of plants that you should not buy. And you also may consider, before you buy wildflower mixes, which are pretty readily available at like your big box store, your hardware store, that sort of thing, garden centers. Usually, well, not always, but oftentimes they'll contain aggressive or invasive non-native species. And these are seed mixes usually that have been grown and harvested in other parts of the United States or even Canada. So, you know, some of them might come from the Midwest or the Northeast, and it's just a different climate. They're going to behave a little bit differently in the Willamette Valley. So just be a little bit weary of those. If there's a particular non-native plant you're interested in, there are some things that you can have in the back of your mind, and if these things stack up, you might ask yourself more questions about should you purchase it. But if it produces large amounts of seeds, provides berries for wildlife, spreads quickly by runners, underground roots, or plant fragments, and or is unusually pest and weather resistant. So just to be clear, there are plants that have these qualities, great plants, maybe native plants that have some of these qualities, but they're not weeds. But this just tends to be, there are a lot of weeds that have these qualities. So just the more of these that stack up, I would just consider, you know, doing a little bit more research to find, you know, if you should bring this into your backyard. Holly is something that comes to mind. Cherry laurel, Portuguese laurel, things like that, or vinca, something that I think, you know, checks some of these boxes. So there are kind of 4 categories of ways of controlling weeds, and so let's break some of those down. Mechanical, and I would put under that mowing, hand pulling, cutting, and also burning. So there's, I'm a pretty big fan of using a weed torch, which is a propane powered torch to burn weeds when they're very small, just after they've emerged. And I think it works remarkably well. I think it's a really nice tool, especially if like the weeds are coming up through your pavers or something like that, coming up through cracks in the driveway, things like that. I think it's a really effective tool. Use with caution, proceed with caution. Do not use against like the siding of your house, or even under plants that you really care about. Sometimes I've like I was using it one time under a rosemary bush. And so I was trying to burn the weed under the rosemary bush, but then the heat rises and I started smelling this amazing fragrance. I'm like, oh crap, I gotta not do that. So proceed with caution, but I think it's a useful tool. Cultural control methods, I think, are perhaps like maybe the most, I think there's a lot of room for growth for people in developing these cultural methods of controlling weeds. I would say shading sometimes is a good option. So if you have a weedy corner of your backyard and you establish, say, really dense evergreen shrubs above those weeds, then if those weeds are, plants that need sun, they're not going to be able to survive under the shade of those evergreens, for example. Planting appropriate competitive vegetation, I think there's a lot of room for growth. I see mulch in my opinion, is really overutilized. And I think in a lot of cases, it's better to plant a competitive ground cover that is going to form a mesh. It's going to weave a ground cover plant community so that weed seeds can't, fly in and establish, and also so that weeds are less likely to pop up through the middle of them. So I think there's a lot of great potential for improving those control methods. Biological is something I don't know a whole lot about, honestly. These are things like parasites, predators, and pathogens. You can think about, government agencies have released different caterpillars to control, like tansy ragwort. I can't remember the name of the caterpillar exactly, but also like these are things that take a long time. So you see this picture here to the right has like a goat, a crew of goats, which is really cool. I just think it's awesome that goats can be used to control brush, and they eat everything. It's awesome. But this is a slow process. Like, they're eating the leaves of the blackberry and the canes, some of the canes. And as soon as they leave, in a couple months, depending on what time of year it is, those blackberries are just going to grow back. So the goats are going to have to visit over and over and over and over. So anyway, it's something that requires patience. And chemical methods, and these should totally be like the last resort. So if nothing else works, maybe there's a case to be made for chemicals to be used. This would include things like spraying an herbicide or painting an herbicide. So some shrubs, it's a common way to control them by cutting them at the base and then painting the cut with a really high concentration of an herbicide. I will note that, this is a last resort, and many people, I believe, don't understand the risks associated with pesticides, and that includes organic pesticides. So in some cases, organic pesticides can be deceptively dangerous. So I'm thinking about, like, vinegar is an herbicide that's approved for organic use. And that may seem like kind of benign thing to use in your yard, but you should really be cautious with it because like the concentration of vinegar that we use in cooking is 5%, and this is at least, at least 20, like 40% vinegar. So it's a really strong acid. It can really burn your skin. So just definitely proceed with caution and follow the label. The label is the law. If you do not understand what the label is saying, you should seek someone who does understand, ideally a licensed pesticide applicator, if you are going to follow that route. So we can also minimize the spread of weeds. That's something that we all can do. And weeds are spread by humans and other animals. So here we see on the right, really common, we go hiking, and say we go hiking in the gorge or something like that, tall grasses, grass seeds, they get stuck to our shoelaces, and then we put those boots on the next hiking trip, say in Forest Park or something like that, and we're spreading around the seeds. So that's very common. It's a good idea to brush your dog before getting in the car. Not only does it help keep your car clean, but reduces the spread of those, potentially the spread of those weed seeds. So they're also spread by machinery and equipment. And the example that I could think of is like, say you mow your lawn and then you offer to mow the neighbor's lawn, and you just mowed through a bunch of weed seeds. Well, those might stick to the mower and you might spread those to your neighbor's yard. So, and also, of course, weeds are spread by natural processes, wind, water. Yeah, it's just that's a part of life too. You can minimize your impact by leaving wildflowers in the wild. I can think of quite a few arguments for why you should leave wildflowers in the wild, and this is just yet another one. Like I mentioned, clean your dog's fur before leaving the natural area, but also clean your boots. I've seen some bike tire cleaning stations at mountain biking trailheads, which I think is pretty neat. And if you're able to, cleaning your car tires is also a really good idea. Just generally, the principle is to leave seeds where they may have originated. And if you are doing any sort of aquatic recreation, cleaning your subboards, inspecting your subboards maybe before you're leaving the area. If you have a boat, emptying the bilge water and checking the external portion to avoid spreading aquatic pests. So not just, in this case, I'm not just talking about aquatic weeds, but also there are mollusks and snails and things that might try and hitch a ride. So here are some really common backyard invaders. This is really where we get into learning a little bit more about these probably very familiar faces. So I hesitate a little bit to put this on a presentation, but ultimately it's a good idea because so many people do consider dandelions a weed. So I guess if you want to reduce the spread of dandelions, you want to control a good amount of them. Really, the method is to control dandelions when they're young, before they've established and before they've set seed. That being said, dandelions, they start flowering, I think, February, March, in some microclimates, and maybe like early February or something. And these are really important times because there's not a whole lot, especially in towards March, there's not a whole lot of other flowers available for native bees to forage. So when native bees, like mason bees, may come out, as soon as the beginning of March, maybe mid-March, and they need sources of pollen and nectar to forage, and so dandelions tend to be a good source of that because they're, they can be pretty plentiful and grow on people's lawns and stuff. So yeah, it's good to consider the sort of the habitat value of dandelions also. But in order to control them and reduce the numbers in your lawn, you may consider using something like this dandelion stomper here. It's a pretty cool tool, says bottom left photo. Pretty cool tool. Basically, it works like, you hold the handle at the top, and then it's got that little stomp pad on the bottom, and it's got these metal spikes. And so that you center the metal spikes on top of the dandelion, you push it in, and as you push it in, it closes on the dandelion. And when you push down the plunger at the top, and it pulls up and releases it. So it's a really nifty tool. And, I reckon I could probably get, 100, 200 dandelions out in an hour. If you're going to do a large number of them, I think it's a good idea to carry like a block or a brick or something like that you can hold in one of your hands to push the plunger down, because doing it 100 times, it really starts to wear on your wrists. Dandelions also have other benefits beyond forage for bees though. So they can also help aerate your lawn, which is something that will ultimately help your grass grow stronger, develop deeper roots. Herb Robert. In order to identify it, you want to look for these fuzzy red stems that come from a central rosette. So the stems all come from one central point. Very similar foliage to a Pacific Northwest native called Pacific Bleeding Heart, but very different stems and very, very different flowers. So flower has 5 petals, and that's typical of geraniums. It's able to eject seeds up to 20 feet. So when these seed pods here, when they turn like brown and dried, just kind of brushing by them can cause them to eject. Really easy to remove them, just hand pull them, get them before they flower and get them before they seed. Really easy identifier also for Herb Robert is that it smells awful when it's crushed. I've heard people refer to this plant as Stinky Bob. Shining geranium, another geranium species. You want to look for red stems. This time kind of glossy red, no white hairs on them. Shiny, rounded, lobed leaves that towards the end of their life cycle, they turn that purple, reddish purple. Very similar flower to the previous one. All these geranium species will develop a beak, so kind of a seed pod with a tapered point at the end. Can also eject seeds up to 20 feet. And it also happens to be a really easy one to remove by hand. Not a big problem. Pokeweed, common backyard invader. Not as easy to hand weed. You want to look for green or red stems with large, simple leaves. And the difference between simple and compound is a really good thing to understand with like plant anatomy in terms of identifying weeds and just all kinds of plants. Really useful skill. It produces purple and black berries. This is usually a plant that comes on the scene later in the season. It's not usually one of the first to show up in the spring. I haven't noticed that. Seeds are dispersed by birds eating the berries and depositing them off site. The berries are toxic. Don't eat the berries, but birds seem to really like them. To remove the young ones, you can pull up the young shoots. Make sure to get the taproots. It sends a taproot, which goes really far down. If you're just looking to control its spread, you can't remove the whole taproot and all that. Not feasible. Cut it before it flowers and produces seeds. And for larger specimens, you're going to need a shovel. You see, here's a shovel for scale, but some of these things look massive. Like the root system just looks like sweet potato size. It's massive. So yeah, it can be quite the workout to get them with a shovel. Bishop's weed. Look for bluish, green, delicate foliage that is almost always variegated. Almost always it's variegated. I can't really recall any time I've seen in walking around in neighborhoods in Portland where it's not. But it spreads by the rhizome, creeping underground stems and roots. So to control this, a little bit different from the previous ones, you want to dig up the entire plant, including underground roots, and when you want to dispose of the soil in the garbage, which is sad, but that is because you don't want it getting into the municipal compost system, and yeah, and you don't want to put it in your own compost bin and spread it around your plants when you apply your compost. So be careful to get all the fragments of these plants because those fragments, like I was mentioning at the start of the presentation, those fragments can grow and create distinct plants. And just monitor for regrowth. It's a big principle in weed control. It's just persistence. Monitor for regrowth. Try and control it once. Dig it out. There's going to be resprouting. Dig it out again. Just persistence. That is a main tenet of weed control. Lesser celandine, something that I'm already seeing quite a bit of now even, has dark green, shiny leaves, yellow flowers with 8 petals. That is a really good giveaway. Really like buttercup yellow leaves, bright. Pale colored bulblets on the stem. So you see this bottom right photo, you can see the bulblets. And it comes on the scene pretty early and flowers and sort of goes dormant in May. So you won't see very much of it after May. It spreads by the rhizomes and these bulblets. So in a similar case to bishop's weed, you want to remove the plant and surrounding soil when blooming in early spring. These bulblets are very fragile. So I've plucked them out of the ground and I've got the little clump, and sometimes I'll try and shake off the soil, but don't do that because the bulblets they just disperse. So got to be kind of gentle in handling those. So I'm going to start the poll. Poll number 2, relaunch polling. Yes. Okay, so which of these have just started to show above ground growth in the Portland area? A, lesser celandine, B, pokeweed, C, bindweed, or D, bishop's weed? Let's see. I'll give y'all a bit to consider. All right. Looks like not getting any votes in, but maybe we're having trouble with our polling. But the correct answer is A, lesser celandine. So all of the rest of these weeds, pokeweed, bindweed, bishop's weed, they show more and they're more actively growing in the summertime on. So lesser celandine is the exception because I'm seeing it now. I'm seeing, it's January and I'm seeing new green growth from that plant. So let's talk about urban weeds along waterways. So before we introduce aquatic weeds, you want to do your research first. Many commonly used aquatics in water gardens are invasive species. So some lily pads can really get out of control, for example. The photo to the right, though, is one that has been a total disaster, Ludwigia. And it was first introduced from, I think people believe, because it comes from South America, but it's used really commonly in aquariums. So it's the idea is that someone must have dumped the contents of their aquarium in a waterway. Totally not great. So, because this is an example of a plant that, is so prolific, it threatens to choke out every backwater of the Columbia and the Willamette River system. So let's not do that. You always want to wash your new plant introduction. So if you buy a bog plant, or a water plant, then washing the roots, and you don't want any like mollusks or anything that have hitched a ride. Keep water gardens separate from waterways. So if where you have a water garden backs up to a different water body, just keep those separated by a landmass, and never dump water garden materials or water from a water garden into a local waterway. Purple loosestrife, I talked a little bit about it before, but it's a semi-aquatic plant. You want to look for square, woody stems and bright magenta colored flower spikes. They're really pretty, and they flower throughout much of the summer. Again, this is Oaks Bottom, which is the natural area in southeast Portland. It spreads via underground rhizomes and also seeds prolifically. Kind of a hallmark of some of these, the most invasive weeds, is that they can kind of do both. Like they reproduce vegetatively and reproductively super well. So that tends to be a calling card of a lot of these. To remove, although I doubt that many of us are working to remove loosestrife, you want to dig out the entire root crown and remove all the fragments, throw it in the garbage. Yellow flag iris, aquatic plant, semi-aquatic plant. You want to look for bright yellow flowers in typical iris form. That iris form is shown in the bottom right. It's got those, I think the sepals are, cascading downward. The fruit is also three-sided, shiny green fruit, and typical of iris is the sword-like leaves and a fan-like patterns, and usually pretty two-dimensional leaves. It spreads vegetatively and by the seed pods, vegetatively, reproductively. To remove it, you want to remove it before it goes to seed, and you have to dig out all the root fragments because those root fragments can create a new plant. So there's the fruiting body of the iris right there, the immature seed pod, and then the bottom left shows the mature seed pod. And these are seeds that can float along waterways. This is an example of how it colonizes and really can establish itself. A lot of the Columbia Slough has a yellow flag iris problem. The tree of heaven, a really common one. I see it walking around like industrial areas in Portland. It's so common that it's, wedged itself in between the sidewalk and the foundation. Just classic. You want to look for suckers coming from the base of the tree. More often than not, it's a suckering tree. Sometimes people will actually prune it up like a tree. Don't do that, just remove it. It has large, alternately arranged. So there's another good plant anatomy thing to look up if you're not familiar. Alternate versus opposite. That's a good thing to look up. And the difference between a leaf and a leaflet also is a good thing to look up. So as those leaflets are in pairs, and it smells like rancid peanut butter. That's That's a good identifier. It spreads vegetatively, sprouting from the stump and root portions, and also seeds prolifically. It has those winged seeds right there. You can hand pull the small seedlings pretty easily for plants that are up to, I think it's like 1.5 inches. You may be able to use a weed wrench, which we'll see a photo of that. So the root system is aggressive enough of these plants to cause damage to sewers and foundations. And if you've ever had to repair a sewer line, you know how expensive that is. So yes, it pays to be proactive. There's a picture of a weed wrench, really cool tool. It's got some lever action. And as you pull back on the tool, these teeth grab the base of the plant. And then so you have like a little fulcrum to yank the plant out. So there's what it looks like when it's just germinated, tree of heaven. It wedges itself in, in between bricks and, like I said, in between the sidewalk and the foundation. And it produces these winged nutlets called samaras. Kind of looks like the fruit of maple trees. The bark or the tree looks fairly similar to a black walnut if you just look at the leaves and the leaflets. So they're arranged, the leaflets are arranged in a similar way to the black walnut, but the fruits and the flowers are very different. And of course, a walnut produces this green fruit, inside of which is a walnut. Also, the tree of heaven has a very smooth bark, while the black walnut has this deeply fissured bark. English ivy, I'm sure many of us are pretty familiar. I've seen this around. It's pretty ubiquitous. You want to look for a vigorous woody vine, small white flowers in tight clusters, and then they eventually produce these dark, deep purple berries. It spreads vegetatively by stem fragments. Also, the seeds are dispersed by birds. During the wintertime, birds actually enjoy the berries quite a bit. To remove them, you want to cut, because they're often climbing up trees, so you want to cut it from the base of the trees and then dig out the roots. And you can, if you've got a large patch of it and you're just trying to keep it under control, just cut the flowers to prevent fruiting, and that will limit its spread a bit. When you're handling English ivy, it's a good idea to wear gloves because it actually doesn't affect different people. It affects different ways, but it can cause contact dermatitis, irritate your skin quite a bit. So here we have an example in the bottom left, just like the massive trunk that this vine can create. That's probably a good 3-inch diameter trunk right there, 4 maybe. And what's been done here is a technician has probably come through with a machete or a saw and sawed like a window of it. Because if it's not connected to the root system, the top part is going to die. But you don't want to yank those vines out of the tree, because yanking them can damage the bark of the tree and really negatively affect it, especially if those vines go all the way around the tree. You can actually do what's called girdling the tree, which is really not good. So this is a common thing for these like stewardship events that various nonprofits and City of Portland and others put on. People here are demonstrating how you can roll up the green carpet, so to speak, of English ivy. It's a good idea to cut maybe like a square rectangle of it that's, I don't know, between 5 and 10 feet wide, and then start rolling it up. And then another person here just kind of helps, wrap the burrito, but then also picking out spots where the ivy is still rooted to the ground. Old man's beard, a really common one as well. Right now, walking around, you may just see these white, puffy seed heads. It's nearly evergreen, but it's like the leaves are nearly evergreen, but it's not totally evergreen. all year round. You want to look for a deciduous woody vine, 5 leaflets, white puffy seed tails, and it totally blankets other vegetation. Pretty unsightly, can climb up gutters. Yeah, not the looker. It spreads vegetatively, and also the seeds are dispersed by animals and rain and wind. The wind will just catch those puffy seed tails and send them around. To remove it, you can cut the vine at the base of whatever it's climbing up and dig out the root if you're able to, because they have really deep, the roots are really tricky. And when you're removing the vines, proceed with caution, because when you yank the vines, they break so easily at the joints. So you kind of have to finesse them to really get them off of whatever you're going to get them off of. So small tugs. And then if they've gone to seed, retrieve as many seeds as possible and dispose of them in the trash. Or if you have a wood stove, that's an option. Himalayan blackberry, delicious fruit, really pokey, really pokey plant. I was controlling blackberries yesterday and my legs are really cut up, but you want to look for thick, red, arching canes, large, round-ish toothed leaves with 5 leaflets. It spreads mostly by stem fragments and rhizomes. Seeds are dispersed by birds because they, like humans, love the berries as well. The berries are really like the best blackberries, I think, in terms of taste. They just don't store very well. To remove them, cut the canes to about 1 foot, and then, because that'll give you the space to dig around with a shovel, not get poked in the face while you're doing it. And for this, you may consider planting dense overstory plants to shade out the blackberries, if that is an option for your wherever you're gardening. And then, like I said, a tenet of controlling weeds is just monitoring for regrowth and intervening when they pop back up again. Leather gloves are really helpful for handling blackberry. It will make all the difference if you've got a lot of it to control. It's just so worth it. It costs you like $10 or whatever. And those are those berries right there. So high alert invasives, a lot of these are considered noxious weeds, but we really want to be on lookout for these. Spurge laurel, it's a Daphne species, so the flowers smell really good. Those yellow flowers right there. Dark green leaves that are shiny on the top, lighter on the underside. They're spirally arranged along the stem. So like I said, the flowers have a nice fragrance. The berries, when unripe, are green, like in the top photo, but then they turn this deep purple black when they're ripe. It spreads by seeds because the birds and rodents will disperse those fruit, but it also it's probably mostly spreads vegetatively through the root sprouts. To remove, you can hand pull the little ones when they're not too established, but larger shrubs like this one in the bottom photo here, it's probably going to have to definitely going to have to get in there with a shovel. A weed wrench, if the stem's diameter is no more than 1.5 inches. Definitely wear gloves when you're handling this, because it is toxic, and also the berries are toxic. So here's an example of how spurge laurel can really establish in oak woodlands, which is bummer. Oak woodlands are like one of my favorite habitats, and it's just such a bummer to see how successful they are at colonizing the understory. Even in an environment where there's not that much light, they still can thrive. Yellow archangel. Thankfully, I don't see as much of this around, so I'm glad to say it. But I know it's around. Just I guess not in my immediate neighborhood. You want to look for variegated leaves, which are opposite. So on opposite side of the stem. So the stem is here, opposite side. Oval and hairy with coarsely toothed edges. Small yellow hooded flowers. That is, yeah, that's a pretty dead giveaway. Very unique flower shape. Spreads vegetatively by the stem fragments, also spreads by seed, another plant that can do both. To remove it, dig up the entire plant. You can sheet mulch if the infestation is large. So sheet mulching is something I talk about more in my longer presentations, but put down cardboard, ton of mulch on top, right over the weeds. That's the gist of it. And then monitor for regrowth. Again, so important. The stems and roots tend to break off when they're being pulled. So just be really careful when you are removing all those pieces. Scotch broom, also called Scots broom, like possessive Scots. I call it Scotch broom. You want to look for a woody shrub with showy yellow flowers. Yeah, when you see the flowers, it's a total giveaway. It can get 10 feet tall. When they get older, like the bark gets really rigid, has small leaves, and the seeds and the pods, when they're dry, they burst and scatter. So they're protected. The seeds are protected from the pod, and they remain viable for, I think, hundreds of years. They can be viable for hundreds of years, which is pretty incredible. Very resilient plants. To remove them, you want to pull the small plants and get their roots, definitely, by hand. Really easy to do right now. The soil's really moist, so if you've got little ones popping up, that is a pretty enjoyable task, actually, to just go out and yank them. Larger plants, you might need to use a weed wrench. If they're over 2 inches in diameter and not green at the base, so they're a little bit more established, and you just cut as low as possible, and you can try repeat cutting or maybe even painting with an herbicide if that is what the situation calls for. There are also nitrogen fixers. Plants in the legume family tend to be. So this is a pea family plant, and they're also allelopathic. So they will emit chemical into the soil that inhibits some plants' growth. Speaking of allelopathic plants, garlic mustard, another one that does that same thing. It's a biennial plant, meaning it completes its life cycle in 2 years. Although it has been seen that it can complete it in 1 year as well, which is not great. So in year 1, you want to look for this small rosette of round kidney-shaped leaves with scalloped edges. And year 2 is when they bolt in the spring of year 2. Elongated flower stalk appears. It spreads by animals, people, equipment, car tires, that sort of thing. To remove it, you can hand pull it, not too tricky, dispose of it in a bag, and you should put it in the garbage. So here's a diagram of like the life cycle. So here we see in March to March of the second year, it's staying pretty squat, pretty low plant, and then year 2 in the spring is when it bolts. So it sends up that stalk. Mid-April is when it tends to flower and it get really tall, and then mid-May they have the immature seed pods, and then beginning of summer when they have the dry stalks, and just walking through those dry stalks, they just scatter seeds like that. You want to get it before it does that. Japanese knotweed, very common invasive plant in Portland. You look for large leaves, hollow reddish stems. Spreads vegetatively by root fragments, and those are transported by humans and machinery and all sorts of things. to remove them, you really should contact your weed control agency. So if you're in east of the Willamette River, you should definitely contact East Multnomah. If you're west of the river, but still in Portland, contact West Multnomah, Hillsborough, Washington County, that area. Contact Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District, because you may need some help and advice in controlling this weed, and it's pretty important to get it right, I think. A couple knotweeds that are all pretty weedy, and they are all in the area. Most of the time I see Japanese knotweed, but there's the Himalayan and the giant knotweed as well. There's a pencil for size, and you can differentiate those. Here's an example of what it looks like when it colonizes the stream side. It just really just makes a thicket. It just seems like a nightmare for habitat restoration technicians to have to control that. So here's an example of a plant that we really, there's not that much of it right now, but we really want to control kudzu. It's known as the plant that ate the South. And if you see this plant with 3 leaflets, purple, pink, pea-like flowers, call 1-800-INVADER. That's Oregon Department of Agriculture number, and they will come and control it wherever it is. So we talked about controlling weeds. But what do you do when you have controlled the weeds, and what comes next? What can I do to increase the habitat value of where I'm gardening? So planting native plants is a great place to start. So let's talk a little bit about native plants, kind of a teaser. And so native plants, just referring to plants that historically have been found in the Willamette Valley prior to European settlement. Usually folks use the date of 1850, but there were fur trappers in the region before that time. But yeah, that's a good rule of thumb. Native plants are adapted to the local weather and local climatic conditions. So they're naturally, because they're accustomed to the climate and the pests and animals that are here, that can be really excellent choices for your garden. Wildlife also recognize their flowering and fruiting cycles, as opposed to something that came from Europe, which is quite pretty and may do a lot of good for the native species. Europe maybe doesn't do as much good for those that are in that grew up in the Willamette Valley. Oftentimes, if they're planted in the right spot, they're quite drought tolerant, so they need less water when they're established as well. Less water means lower water bills, saving a bit of money, less maintenance as well. They are also, like planting in layers will create lots of food and shelter for wildlife, which is great. And there really isn't a need to use chemical fertilizers or pesticides on these plants. They don't need babied or kept alive with these harmful chemicals. And totally, I think is the main selling point is they're beautiful. I think there's just so much beauty that you can bring to your backyard, which is amazing. So to set you up for success after you've controlled the weeds, let's talk about a couple things: timing and plant selection, placement, and how to care for them when they are in the spot. So when to plant. So fall or winter is best. It is a really nice time to plant, but that being said, there are many great times to plant. it just kind of depends on what you're going for. I wouldn't recommend, trying to plant a big tree in the summertime because it might get stressed. But yeah, fall and winter, wonderful time to plant. And you want to, before you go to the nursery and get super excited about plants, like I do, I just get so excited. I just want to buy all the things. But you should take note of the areas that you're going to garden in. And on the bottom photo here, we see that usually along the street side, it tends to be a really sunny area. So you want to look for plants that are full sun, a little bit, maybe halfway in between the street and your house. If you've got some shrub cover, that might be an area that's partly shaded, part sun area. And then if you're looking to garden under a tree on the north side of a house, right against a house, against a fence line, something like that, maybe look for a plant that is that thrives in full shade conditions. Make notes of this. The more preparation you can do, more observation you can do of your site, the more money you're going to save for yourself when you buy the right plant for the right place. Also consider things like microclimates before purchasing plants. Just because a plant grew up in the Willamette Valley is native to the region doesn't mean that it'll thrive every single spot in your yard. Considering microclimates can help you get the planting plan just right. So these are some common urban features that influence microclimates. So houses and buildings, things that are going to have lots of thermal mass and cast lots of shade, or a big one is, homes often have eaves that extend beyond the walls of the house. So the rain is not going to fall directly under those eaves. So you want to consider that and maybe choose plants that are really drought tolerant because they're not going to get a lot of water just from rainfall. Fences, those can redirect wind and also cast shade. Retaining walls can retain lots of heat. They're, if you've got a concrete retaining wall, it's got a lot of thermal mass to it. It's going to store the heat. It's going to release it, in the evening, and keep those plants warmer for longer, which can be advantageous or disadvantageous depending on what you're doing. Large rocks, they can do a similar thing with thermal mass, but also, they can create really cool and shady pockets at the bottom side of those rocks. They can increase drainage, which will help things like succulents, sedums. That's a good environment for them. Raised beds, they'll warm your soil up sooner in the growing season, and so that's something to consider. Terraces and slopes, if you've got a slope, water is going to drain off of it faster. So again, maybe something that consider something that is a little bit more drought tolerant if you've got quite a bit of a slope. Paved and gravel surfaces are, they're going to influence the thermal mass. They're going to keep things hotter, drier. And trees. So if you've got a big Doug fir, those roots are going to suck up lots of water. It's also going to cast a lot of shade. So these are some things to be aware of when you're establishing native plant communities. So it's a good idea when you're planting to think about communities and as opposed to individual species. I think it's a really good place to start, to just observe nature, go out to areas that might be similar to wherever you're gardening, and just see what's growing. So communities are loose associations of plants that are adapted to similar conditions. So really common ones, vine maple, sword fern, and I think at the bottom that's like wild ginger. So all plants that are kind of a forest native to like the forests around here. So there's usually not that many defined boundaries with these communities, and it lends itself to maybe a little bit more of an organic look. So take a bunch of notes, consider your yard's condition, have fun and experiment. There's, you know, it's really challenging. Even professionals get it wrong in terms of like what will survive and what won't. So, you know, you're going to have to experiment. Use your resources. There are plenty of great government agency resources. East Multnomah's Native Plant Database, Portland Plant List, King County up in Washington State has sample planting plans as well, which kind of show you how example of how they lay things out. Remember the right plant, right place. You've taken all these notes, you've prepared, you've gone to the nursery, you've seen what you know, what these different plants advertise that they like. Spacing is, you know, there's a little bit of an artistic touch required, I think, with this, because, well, if you want something to grow really dense, you know, you can pack shrubs in pretty tight, or you can pay really close attention to what the tags say. So this Oregon grape is going to get, I don't know, 6 feet wide. So if you don't want a look where your plants are touching, you maybe space your Oregon grape at least, you know, 6 feet away from another Oregon grape, for example. And you can do it in stages. It's a good way to not get overwhelmed as well. Start with your trees and larger shrubs, get those established, and then fill those in with smaller shrubs and ground covers. That's a good way, you know, start with your structure, get your structure in place, and then kind of work around the structure that you've created. Large trees, you know, there's going to be fewer places for you to put large trees in your landscape, but good place to start about thinking, including large tree, great habitat for so many birds and different animals. So big leaf maples, there are different kinds of fir, western red cedar, I think it's an incense cedar if I'm not mistaken, red alder, and even a sequoia or something like that. Jeez, that would be big. Vine maples, dogwoods, twin berries. This is a beautiful crabapple. So things like that, or maybe the next thing to consider on your list, smaller shrubs, thimbleberries, your red flowering currants, your what do we got, like your thimbleberries. So these are the top 3 things you should consider, and there's so many beautiful options. Native plants for Willamette Valley yards breaks it. This is a resource from Oregon Metro. They've broken it down in these same categories, like trees, large shrubs, small trees, and shrubs. So that's a great resource. And then start to fill in with your ground covers. I think this is where a lot of the color and fun comes in, at least for me. Wild irises, wood violets, trilliums, or this is a sorrel, shooting star, gorgeous options. And then once you've put them in, you want to take care and maintain your new landscape. For watering, early morning is best to water deep and less frequently is something that is a really good practice. It just helps it so that water doesn't evaporate. If you water in the middle of the day, a lot of that water can evaporate. And the plants are most able to take up that water in the morning. And mulch is great, retains moisture, it prevents weeds. Really important in the establishment phase of those trees and shrubs especially. Weed early and often. Like I was saying before, just in the weeds portion of it, it's like it's so important to just stay on top of it, monitor for regrowth. It's just going to save you so much grief to pull little plants as opposed to pulling behemoths that have established. There's tons of opportunities to learn more about native plants. There's so many excellent resources. You can attend a naturescaping basics workshop, rain garden 101 workshop. There's also the native plants workshop, East Multnomah. And we'll be sure to share this link up top. More resources, like I mentioned, East Multnomah's native plant resources page, excellent place. Native plant database, Portland plant list from City of Portland. That's a really good one. That one also has the best weeds list at the bottom. And then King County landscape plans from our neighbors in Washington. They have some sample landscape plans that can give you some inspiration there. To learn more about invasive plants, like I said, the Portland plant list, the invasive plant fact sheets, less regionally specific, but they've got a lot of great information on that. And I mentioned this before when I talked about kudzu, but if you see any of those species where there was, so the red lettering, the hot species, contact Oregon Department of Agriculture at 1-800-INVADER or their email at invasive-info@oda.state.or.us. So that is about it. One last plug, I guess, for the other workshops. I've attended, I think, almost all of them, and I can safely say they're excellent. Presented by great presenters, great contractors for the agency. So if this piqued your interest, I highly encourage you signing up. They're free as well. So and with that, I think that's about it. Thank you very much for coming and joining me virtually for this Fix It Fair, and it means a lot.